like hearing stories about World War II. And there's lots of interesting stories, many of which focus on the brave men of World War II and the number of different adventures and battles and difficult things that men did. But I'm going to tell you a little story, an American home-based story of some pretty amazing women who also made their contribution uh, to the war effort. Well, this story started in the small town of North Platte, Nebraska. Now, North Platte is well, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of Nebraska. Back in 1941, there were about 12,000 people in the town. It was a small town, but its one claim to fame was this was a place where the Union Pacific Railroad ran right through this town. Well, on this particular day, it was December 17th, 1941, literally just 10 days after the bombing that happened in Pearl Harbor. The American war effort was underway, and the word came out in North Platte that a train was going to be going through, and not just any old train. This was a troop transport train, and it was going to be carrying a group of the young men from North Platte. It was rumored that the 134th Infantry Regiment of the Nebraska Army National Guard was going to be coming through their town with their young men on it. And so word spread, and people said, we should go down and meet the train. And so they baked cookies, they got some cigarettes and magazines, and they headed on down. Well, it was hard to know exactly when it would come, and didn't come. People went home and said, oh, it's coming now. So then by the time it came, there were probably 500 people waiting. The train pulled in. Well, one of the things in this time, the trains were steam engines, and North Platte happened to be a place that steam engines would pull in. And there's some things that happened. The water tender had to be refilled, and the wheels had to be relubricated. So it was said, 10-minute break right here. The crowd rushed up to the train and looked, and they looked, they up and forth. There were 300 soldiers on this train, but anyone recognized. They did a little inquiry and found out it was indeed the 134th Regiment, but of the Kansas National Guard. Oh, this was so disappointing. Then somebody said, well, look, we've got cookies, we have things. They're not our boys, but they're somebody's boys. So they went up and down the train, and they handed out goodies, and they got big smiles and thank yous, and it was wonderful. And 10 minutes later, the train had to take off, and they waved, and everyone felt really good about it. Well, everyone felt so good that one young woman, actually a 26-year-old drugstore sales girl named Ray Wilson, she wrote a letter to the local paper the very next day. And she basically said, I don't know if you came down to greet the train that had the troops on it, but if you didn't, you should have, because it was really something. It was a little bit of a mistake. We thought it was going to be our boys, but we shared what we had with them, and they were so grateful. They stood up a little proud. One of them said, boy, this is the first home-baked food they had in a really long time. She said, I remember hearing some stories. In World War I, our mothers and grandmothers created a little canteen for troops that were going through on the train. Why don't we create our own canteen in North Platte, and we could get together and we could supply things. We could export a little morale. Well, several days later, the first meeting of the North Platte Canteen women came together. They made some plans. They talked to some local business people. They gave out little assignments, who should bake what, who was bringing things. And on Christmas Day, 1941, the women showed up. the first train pulled in, and they went up and invited people, and they started handing out, and they handed out, well, treats, and it was so wonderful. And they said, this is good, we ought to do it again. Well, what started with greeting just one train very quickly went, as it turns out, the war effort was really moving up, and pretty soon they realized this small little group wasn't going to do it. So they did what any good women would do. They started organizing. They made committees, they got teams, and they said, okay, we're going to have to split this up. Let's assign it out. Well, it got going, and well, first they were using a local hotel kitchen to do some things, but Ray Wilson, well, she got herself a little meeting with the head of the Union Pacific, and she said, we've got a problem here, and you happen to have a lunch counter that's just sitting there. Don't you think you ought to use it? Give it to us so that we can help support the troops. And the head of the Union Pacific thought that was a splendid idea. So he did. And pretty soon they moved in, and they really spruced the place up. They had it set to go, and they started organizing. So first they got a contact. They said, well, how are we going to know when people are coming? So it was secret when troops were being transported. You couldn't just you didn't want the enemy to know, but there was somebody with the railroad who could call up the head woman who was at the canteen. And the message was, put the coffee pot on, and said, okay, got it. She would put the word out, and indeed they got huge coffee urns, and they started going, okay, we got to think about what we're doing. So pretty soon they started going, oh, I want us to remember here right now, this was smack in the middle of World War II, and the effort started moving towards rationing. So pretty soon people got ration coupon books and rationing gasoline and sugar and flour and a whole bunch of the really good ingredients that one would need. So it was time to put the women in action. There started women from a particular church would say, hey, we'll take next Tuesday. Women from another organization would say, we got Wednesday. Well, pretty soon as it went along, it grew and grew, and they realized just North Platte wasn't going to be enough. The word went out. As things really got going, there were 120 communities throughout the area who each those women showed up to take their turn. Now, how would this go? The train would pull up. At first, nobody really knew, but after a while, the conductors and some of the officers would say, you're going to watch out. We're coming into North Platte. Got to get off. Go check out the canteen. At first, people I don't know, do I want to? Is it worth it? They would get off, and then they would go, they would be pointed. Well, actually, there were young women who were on the platform saying, welcome to North Platte, come on in. They had baskets, and they had fresh fruit and cigarettes and candy. They said, if you want to go in, get yourself a little snack in there. They went in, and there it was. The mothers, the aunties, the grandmas, the daughters were there, and they provided a feast. They had food of every kind, and they had donuts and cookies and hard-boiled eggs. They would do sandwiches. They would have little bottles of fresh milk going on, and donuts and soup. Now, one of the things that somebody came up with as an idea, they said, you know what, there's probably going to be somebody of these young men. And then as I found out, eventually a lot of women service members were there too. Somebody's got to have a birthday. We should bake birthday cakes. So as they went forward, every day there were 20 birthday cakes. And when soldiers come in and said, hey, who's got a birthday? If they had one, here's a cake, and they sang happy birthday. They made phone calls, they sent telegrams, they had magazines, they had a piano, they would do a little dancing. all of this happened in the 10 or 15 minutes worth of time before all aboard, and everybody would have to run to get back out. Now, one might think, wow, to do one of those in a day, I would be kind of tired. But no, these women, they started at 5 in the morning and they went to the last train came through at night, often after midnight. It started that there would be 5 trains, 10 trains. Towards the time when it was really going, 23 trains a day. There would be 3,000, 6,000, 8,000, 15,000 service members who came in, and nobody was charged a penny for this. Now, eventually, I know I told you 120 communities, they figured 55,000 people, volunteers, almost entirely women, showed up to say, there's not much we can do. We don't manufacture things here. We're not going to fight in the war, but we sure can cook. And what they said was, over in the fields of battle, maybe on a sad night, on a cold night, somebody might say, boy, I sure wish I had some of those popcorn balls from North Platte Canteen. I sure wish I had some of the hard-boiled eggs and sandwiches and a cup of hot coffee. And so there it was, over the course of the next 4 years, not a single train was missed. Everyone was greeted with a smile and a welcome to North Platte. Welcome, we wish you well, stay safe. And that's the story, how a group of women rolling up their sleeves, doing what it takes over the course of 4 years, was able to provide hospitality, strength, and caring to over 6 million service members. And that's the story that even these years later, we remember about those strong, kind women of North Platte, Nebraska. So thank you for taking a little journey with me and listening to a story of some women from the past who did something kind of extraordinary with ordinary tools.